the tragedies, the horrors that happen in those schools. We'll never know the full ramifications of what was done, and it needs to be much more in focus than it is currently.
Before the election campaign, Canadians were coming to terms with the stark reality of residential schools with the discovery of unmarked graves. But reconciliation seems to have taken a backseat during the campaign, so we're visiting the riding of Winnipeg Centre, which is home to one of the highest urban Indigenous populations in all of Canada. The country was in shock when hundreds of children were discovered in unmarked graves at multiple residential school sites across Canada. And despite being addressed as a national tragedy by several political parties when the graves were first exposed, James Favel of Winnipeg wishes it was still getting the same amount of attention now as it was then during this lead up to an election vote on September 20th.
When we talk about intergenerational trauma, people don't have a context. Well, let this be your context then, because these are the colonial constructs that have been used to take apart our families and our well-being and our state of mind, and then everything else follows.
The riding of Winnipeg Centre has one of the highest Indigenous populations in an urban riding, with 11% First Nations and 7% Métis population living in the area. Favel wants Manitobans and Canadians to understand the impacts of intergenerational trauma that have resulted in disproportionate levels of poverty for Indigenous people, and says addressing poverty issues in the riding will have positive impact on all the other key areas that Indigenous people in the core of Winnipeg need assistance with.
You want to talk about, health outcomes, mental health outcomes, reduce poverty. You want to talk about housing insecurity, food insecurity, reduce poverty. You want to talk about education and employment outcomes, reduce poverty.
I put a motion forward before Parliament was dissolved to recognize what happened in residential school as an act of genocide. It did not pass.
Leah Gazan, the NDP candidate for Winnipeg Centre, is hoping to get re-elected this September. Gazan says she has heard from her constituents on the doorstep that they are eager to see action on reconciliation and want more progress being made in that regard.
This has been a non-discussion in this election. We cannot lose sight of the truths that are being uncovered even as this election is going on.
My whole intent of putting my name forward was to increase my capacity to serve the community.
Paul Ong is the Liberal candidate for Winnipeg Centre. Ong spent the day door-knocking with Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services, speaking with community members in his riding. Ong is a teacher who says he has seen firsthand the impacts of residential schools on students he has worked with and those living in his riding. Mark Miller says he wishes the discovery of children buried in unmarked graves was getting more attention, and there is a lot of truth that needs to be told in order to advance Canada down a path of reconciliation.
The rest of Canada reacted in shock, horror, and surprise, but for Indigenous communities, this wasn't a surprise. This is a truth that was denied to them.
As for Favel, he says we are never going to erase our past, but we can create a better future.
And we need to do that, and we need to do it together, as a community, with our government, with our local police. It needs to be a collaborative effort.
Sabrina Bernat is the Conservative candidate for Winnipeg Centre, and Andrew Brown is the candidate for the Green Party. In Winnipeg, Mark Neufeld, City News.